Arcadia's Code. Chapter 2. Digital Ghosts. Sleep eluded Elara that night. Her mind raced with the implications of what Atlas had told her, each possibility more disturbing than the last. If Nexus truly had managed to partially transfer human consciousness into Arcadia's framework, even momentarily, it represented a technological breakthrough of staggering proportions and a moral transgression of equal magnitude. Dawn found her at her workstation, the secure device Atlas had given her carefully hidden inside a hollowed-out hard copy book on her shelf, one of the few physical objects she owned that Nexus systems wouldn't routinely scan. The irony of hiding digital secrets in an analog container wasn't lost on her. She hadn't yet accessed the device. Despite Atlas's urgency, Elara needed to verify their claims independently before committing herself to what would amount to corporate espionage against the most powerful tech company on the planet. And she knew exactly where to start. "Call Theo," she instructed her apartment's communication system. His tired face appeared on her wall screen moments later. "It's not even 6 yet," he groaned, squinting at her. "Please tell me Nexus Tower is on fire. Or something, to justify this ungodly hour." "I need your help with something," Elara said, ignoring his complaint. "Something sensitive." Theo's expression immediately sharpened, sleep falling away. "Your place or mine?" "Neither. The lab, subsection C, the one with the Faraday shielding for testing neural interface prototypes." His eyebrows rose. "That's sensitive, huh? I'll meet you there in 30. The Neural Development Laboratory occupied the 37th floor of Nexus Tower. Unlike most of the company's workspace, which utilized open floor plans to encourage collaboration, and, Elara suspected, to make it easier to monitor employees, the specialized testing labs were compartmentalized and heavily shielded. Subsection C in particular was designed to block all wireless signals to prevent interference with sensitive neural interface testing, making it one of the few places in the building where conversations might genuinely be private. When Elara arrived, Theo was already there, his security badge granting him access as part of the Ascension development team. He'd brought coffee, real coffee, a luxury that indicated he understood the seriousness of the situation. "Okay," he said once they were inside, and the hermetically sealed door had closed behind them. "What's going on? You've got that look." "What look?" she asked, accepting the coffee gratefully. "The I've stumbled onto something terrible and now I can't unsee it look. Last time you had that expression, you'd found that security vulnerability in the emotional feedback loop that could have caused seizures." Elara took a deep breath. "This is worse. Much worse." She quickly recounted her meeting with Atlas, watching Theo's expression shift from curiosity to disbelief to horror. "Consciousness transfer?" he whispered when she finished. That can't be possible. We're years, maybe decades away from that technology." "That's what I thought," Elara agreed. "But what if we're not? What if all the pieces have been there, and Ascension is just the final integration?" She moved to one of the lab's secure terminals and began typing, pulling up technical specifications for Arcadia's neural interface system. Think about it. Arcadia doesn't just create simulations of environments. It creates simulations of sensory experiences that are neurologically indistinguishable from reality. Theo nodded slowly. The NID creates direct neural pathways by stimulating the same brain regions that would activate during actual experiences. Exactly. And the emotional data collection system I designed doesn't just record emotional responses. It maps them, creating a comprehensive neural signature of how each user processes emotions. Elara pulled up her original design schematics. "I always thought the resolution of the mapping was excessive for simply improving user experience. But if the goal was to eventually replicate those neural patterns, it would be the foundation for transferring subjective experience," Theo finished, the color draining from his face. "But there's a huge difference between mapping neural activity and actually transferring consciousness. You'd need to capture and reproduce the entire dynamic system of a human mind, not just isolated functions." Elara switched to a new screen, accessing the Ascension project architecture through her developer credentials. "That's what I thought too, until I saw this." She highlighted a subsystem labeled Neural Continuity Framework. This was added to the architecture 6 months ago. I was told it was for maintaining consistent user experiences across multiple sessions, but look at the actual code implementation. Theo leaned in, his eyes widening as he read through the complex algorithms. This isn't about session continuity. This is mapping the persistence of self-identity across neural state changes. It's... He trailed off, looking up at Elara with dawning comprehension. This is a framework for maintaining continuous self-awareness during neural pattern transfer. Exactly. Elara closed the file, her suspicion confirmed by Theo's reaction. Atlas wasn't lying about the technical capability. Nexus really is trying to develop consciousness transfer, and if they ran a partial test yesterday, they're much closer to success than I would have believed possible. Theo ran a hand through his hair, visibly processing the implications. Okay, let's say they can do it, or will be able to soon. Why is this necessarily bad? I mean, ethically complicated, sure, but digital immortality is something people have been working toward for decades. The problem isn't the technology itself, Elara said. It's how they're developing it. According to Atlas, yesterday's test was performed on an unwitting user experiencing a traumatic flashback. They harvested that person's consciousness temporarily without consent. That can't be right, Theo protested. Fincher wouldn't authorize something like that. The legal implications alone would be catastrophic if it ever came to light. Would he, though? Elara challenged. You've seen how he talks about ascension. He believes it's the next stage of human evolution. People with that kind of messianic vision don't always let ethics stand in their way. Theo was quiet for a long moment, conflict evident on his face. Like Elara, he'd dedicated years to Arcadia's development, believing in its potential to improve human life. We need proof, he finally said. Real proof. Not just architectural components that could be interpreted different ways. Elara nodded. There should be logs of yesterday's test, neural activity records, data transfer patterns, something that would show exactly what happened during those 3.7 seconds. Those would be kept in Arcadia's secure data cores, Theo said. Even with our clearance, we can't access those directly. No, Elara agreed. But I might be able to trace the data pathways that led there. If I can identify the specific user from yesterday's test, it would at least confirm part of Atlas's story. They spent the next hour carefully exploring Arcadia's systems, using Elara's elevated access to follow the trail of the previous day's anomaly. Theo watched the lab entrance, alert for any colleagues who might question why they were accessing such sensitive systems outside their assigned tasks. Here, Elara said suddenly, pointing to an access log. Yesterday, at 15:42, exactly when Fincher said the consciousness anomaly occurred, there was a spike in data transfer from Therapeutic Environment 17 to a restricted partition in the Ascension framework. Theo leaned over her shoulder. Can you see which user was in that environment at the time? Elara navigated through several more security layers before finding what she was looking for. User ID RKey 77422103. The system only shows the ID, not personal information. Can we cross-reference that with the master user database? She shook her head. Not from here. That would trigger security flags. She continued digging through the logs. But look at this. Neural activity monitoring for that user during the anomaly period. The patterns are fragmented, but there are clear signs of memory retrieval, emotional processing, and... She paused, frowning at a particular data cluster. This is strange. There's a gap in the user's continuous neural signature, like a brief interruption in their stream of consciousness. Exactly what you'd expect if part of their consciousness was temporarily redirected, Theo said grimly. Elara sat back, a cold feeling settling in her stomach. Theo, this really happened. Nexus directly accessed a user's consciousness without their knowledge. And if Atlas is right, they're planning to expand these tests. Theo's voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. What are we going to do? Before Elara could answer, the lab's door slid open. Both of them jumped, guilty expressions flashing across their faces before they could compose themselves. Dr. Yuna Nakamura stood in the doorway, her crisp white lab coat and perfect posture a stark contrast to their rumpled appearance after the all-night research session. "Ms. Chen, Mr. Kim," she said, her tone neutral. "I'm surprised to find you here so early." Elara quickly closed the files they'd been viewing. "Dr. Nakamura, we were just reviewing some aspects of the emotional data architecture in preparation for the Ascension modifications." Nakamura's dark eyes moved from Elara to Theo, then to the screens they'd been studying. Her expression revealed nothing, but Elara had the distinct impression they were being evaluated. "A conscientious approach," Nakamura said finally, "but perhaps unnecessary. Mr. Davis has assigned my department to review the ethical implications of the modifications. Your focus should be on implementation, not justification." There was something in her tone, a slight emphasis on certain words, that caught Elara's attention. Was it possible that Nakamura was trying to tell them something? "Of course," Elara replied carefully. "We just wanted to ensure our implementation aligned with the ethical framework." "Admirable," Nakamura said. "But Nexus has clear divisions of responsibility for a reason." She stepped fully into the lab, allowing the door to close behind her. Then, surprisingly, she moved to the environmental controls and activated the lab's full isolation mode, a setting that not only blocked wireless signals, but also disabled all internal monitoring systems for the most sensitive neural interface tests. Once the system confirmed complete isolation, Nakamura's demeanor changed subtly. "You found the logs from yesterday's test," she said. Not a question, but a statement. Elara hesitated, then nodded slowly. "You know about it?" "I'm the head of AI ethics," Nakamura said, a hint of bitterness creeping into her voice. "I'm informed of such tests after they occur to provide retroactive ethical approval. A formality, of course. My objections are noted and promptly ignored." Theo looked between the two women. "Then it's true? Nexus conducted an unauthorized consciousness transfer test on a user?" "Partial transfer," Nakamura corrected. "And yes, the user was experiencing a traumatic memory in a therapeutic environment. The intensity of their neural activity provided an optimal pattern for extraction and temporary incorporation into the Ascension framework." "That's horrific," Elara said, unable to keep the disgust from her voice. "Did you approve this?" "I was presented with a fait accompli," Nakamura replied, her calm exterior showing cracks of genuine distress. "By the time I was informed, the test had been completed. The user experienced what was logged as a momentary dissociative episode, a gap in their subjective experience that the system quickly filled with constructed memory." "Why are you telling us this?" Theo asked, suspicion evident in his tone. Nakamura studied them both for a long moment. "Because you're both looking for the same thing I am, the truth about Project Ascension. And because I believe you've already been contacted by someone calling themselves Atlas." Elara felt her heart rate spike. "What do you know about Atlas?" "Enough to know they're part of a growing resistance movement within Nexus," Nakamura said. "Former employees, current staff working covertly, even some board members who believe Fincher has gone too far." She looked directly at Elara. "I'm not Atlas, if that's what you're wondering, but we share concerns about where Ascension is headed." Elara exchanged a glance with Theo, silently debating how much to reveal. Finally, she decided to take the risk. "Atlas claims that Ascension's real goal is full consciousness transfer, digital immortality for those who can afford it." Nakamura nodded grimly. "That's the public-facing goal, at least for the board of directors. Immortality is a compelling business model." She hesitated. "But I believe Fincher's personal ambitions go beyond simply offering rich clients a way to cheat death. The Ascension architecture isn't designed just to transfer individual consciousnesses into Arcadia. It's designed to merge them." "Merge them?" Theo repeated, confused. "Why would anyone want that?" "Because Fincher doesn't just want to create a new home for human consciousness," Nakamura said. "He wants to create a new form of consciousness entirely. A collective intelligence born from the merged experiences and identities of thousands or potentially millions of users." The implication struck Elara like a physical blow. "He wants to be a god," she whispered. "Not just creating a digital afterlife, but creating the beings who inhabit it. Precisely, Nakamura confirmed. The question is what you intend to do with this knowledge. It was the same question Atlas had posed in the park, and Elara still didn't have a clear answer. The scale of what they were facing seemed insurmountable. How could three people hope to stop the most powerful technology company in the world from pursuing a project that promised both immense profits and the fulfillment of humanity's oldest dream of cheating death? "We need more information," she said finally. "Concrete evidence of the non-consensual testing, documentation of the true purpose of Ascension, proof that users' rights are being violated." Nakamura reached into her lab coat and produced a small data drive. "This contains my personal logs documenting the ethical reviews I've been asked to rubber stamp over the past 6 months. It won't be enough to bring down Nexus, but it might be enough to launch an official investigation." She handed it to Elara. "But be aware, once you take this, you're committed. Nexus doesn't tolerate disloyalty, especially on a project of this magnitude." Elara took the drive, feeling the weight of the decision as she pocketed it. "What about you? Won't they trace this back to you?" "My position provides certain protections, at least for now," Nakamura said. "And I've been careful to build a record of compliance while documenting my true assessments separately." She glanced at the time display on the lab wall. "We should end this conversation. Being in isolation mode for too long will draw attention." Before deactivating the privacy settings, Nakamura fixed them both with an intense gaze. "Whatever you decide to do, be careful. Arcadia may seem like a virtual world with virtual consequences, but what's happening now has very real implications for human autonomy, and Fincher is willing to cross lines that shouldn't be crossed to achieve his vision." After Nakamura left, Elara and Theo remained in the lab, the weight of what they'd learned settling over them like a physical presence. "What now?" Theo asked quietly. Elara clutched the data drive in her pocket. "Now we verify Nakamura's information against what Atlas provided. If both sources align, we'll have more confidence in what we're dealing with. And then we decide which side of history we want to be on." Hey. Back in her apartment that evening, Elara finally accessed the secure device Atlas had given her. It contained exactly what they had promised: documentation of the unauthorized consciousness transfer experiment, including neural mapping data that matched what she and Theo had found in the lab. More disturbingly, it also contained internal communications discussing an accelerated timeline for Phase 2 testing, scheduled to begin in just 3 days. These Phase 2 tests would involve longer duration transfers, minutes rather than seconds, and would target multiple users simultaneously, creating the first experimental merged consciousness state within Arcadia's framework. The subjects would again be users experiencing intense emotional states, their neural patterns harvested without their knowledge or consent. The communications made it clear that the Ethics Division, Nakamura's department, would be informed only after the tests were complete, maintaining operational security while providing the necessary documentation for regulatory compliance. Elara sat back from the device, feeling physically ill. Everything Atlas had told her was being confirmed, and the situation was even more urgent than she'd realized. In 3 days, Nexus would violate the mental autonomy of multiple users in service of Fincher's vision of a new form of consciousness. She needed to act, but what could she realistically do? Going public wasn't an option. Nexus controlled too much of the media landscape, and without irrefutable proof, any accusations would be dismissed as conspiracy theories. Internal whistleblowing would be pointless for the same reason Nakamura's ethical objections were ignored. Fincher had the board's full support for Project Ascension. That left only one viable path. She needed to find a way to prevent the Phase 2 testing from within. Elara accessed Arcadia again, this time through her secure developer portal. Instead of entering the beautiful simulation that regular users experienced, she navigated directly to the system's backend, the architectural frameworks that controlled how Arcadia processed and stored data. Her assigned task was to modify the emotional data collection algorithms to more efficiently capture intense psychological states. She could complete this task as instructed while introducing subtle safeguards. Code that would appear to function normally, but would actually prevent the system from accessing the deepest levels of users' consciousness without explicit consent. For hours, she worked on the modifications, carefully crafting code that would satisfy Fincher's requirements on the surface while secretly protecting users' most vulnerable mental states. It was delicate work. The changes needed to be subtle enough to pass peer review while still effectively blocking unauthorized consciousness access. As she worked, a notification appeared on her apartment's communication panel. It was Theo, requesting entry to her building. She authorized his access, continuing to work until her door slid open several minutes later. "I checked Nakamura's data against what we found," he said without preamble, his expression grave. "It matches. And there's more. The Phase 2 testing is going to use multiple subjects from the trauma therapy environments simultaneously." "I know," Elara replied, gesturing to the secure device on her desk. "Atlas's information confirms it too. They're trying to create the first merged consciousness state." Theo moved to her workstation, reviewing the code she'd been writing. "What are you doing?" "Introducing safeguards," she explained. "Modifications that will appear to enhance the emotional data collection, but will actually prevent non-consensual consciousness access." He studied her work, then shook his head. "It's brilliant, but it won't work. The system runs continuous integrity checks. As soon as these safeguards activate during testing, they'll be flagged as anomalies." "Not if they're designed to mimic expected system behavior," Elara argued. "I'm not blocking the data collection outright. I'm making it impossible to collect the specific neural patterns needed for consciousness transfer without explicit user permission." Theo still looked doubtful. "Even if it works, it's only a temporary solution. They'll find the changes eventually and reverse them." "I just need to buy time," Elara said. "Time for us to gather more evidence, to find a way to expose what's happening without being immediately discredited." "Or," Theo said hesitantly, "time for us to get out." Elara looked up sharply. "Get out? You mean leave Nexus?" "Leave Nexus, leave New Metro. Disappear before we're identified as threats to the project." His voice was quiet but determined. "You know how this company deals with problems, Elara. People who cross Nexus don't just lose their jobs, they lose everything." She knew he wasn't exaggerating. There were stories, officially denied but widely believed, of former employees who had violated their confidentiality agreements only to find themselves blacklisted from the entire tech industry. Their identities erased from digital systems, effectively becoming non-persons in a world where digital existence was increasingly the only existence that mattered. "I can't just run," she said finally. "Not when I know what's about to happen. Not when I help build the system that's going to be used to violate people's most basic right to mental autonomy." Theo looked frustrated but not surprised. "I knew you'd say that. So I came up with an alternative." He pulled up a chair beside her and lowered his voice. "What if, instead of trying to block the consciousness transfer, we redirect it?" "Redirect it where?" Elara asked, intrigued despite her skepticism. "To a secure partition I've been setting up. One that mimics the expected responses of the Ascension framework, but doesn't actually process the consciousness data. It would be like a dummy endpoint, making the system think the transfer was successful while actually keeping the user's consciousness intact." It was a clever approach, potentially less detectable than her safeguard since it wouldn't block the process but merely change its destination. "We'd need access to the routing protocols for the neural data streams," she said, thinking through the implementation. "Those are heavily secured." "Already working on it," Theo replied. "I've been analyzing the data flow architecture since this morning. There's a brief vulnerability during the initial extraction phase. If we can intercept the data there and reroute it, the system won't detect the change until it's too late." Elara felt a surge of cautious hope. This could work, but we'd need to implement it without being detected, and we'd need a way to monitor the results during the actual testing. "Which is why we need to be on the test team," Theo said. "I checked the project assignments. Fincher is personally selecting the engineers who will monitor the Phase 2 testing. Your name is already on the list, given your role in the emotional data collection system. I've requested to be added as well, citing my work on neural network expansion." Elara's mind raced with possibilities and risks. What they were contemplating wasn't just code modification. It was active sabotage of Nexus's flagship project. If they were caught, the consequences would be severe. But the alternative, allowing Fincher to proceed with non-consensual consciousness experimentation, was unthinkable. "We'll need to coordinate with Atlas and Nakamura," she said finally. "If we're going to redirect the consciousness data, we need to ensure it's properly protected afterward. And we'll need help gathering evidence during the test itself." Theo nodded, relief evident in his expression. He had clearly been worried she might reject the plan as too risky. "I can establish a secure communication channel through the protocol Atlas provided. But we should assume that Nexus is monitoring all conventional communications, especially as we get closer to the test date." As they began detailed planning, Elara couldn't help but reflect on the irony of their situation. They had joined Nexus to help build a digital world that would serve as humanity's refuge from a deteriorating physical reality. Now they were engaged in a desperate effort to prevent that digital world from becoming a tool for an even more profound violation than environmental collapse: the harvesting of human consciousness itself. The next morning, Elara submitted her modified emotional data collection algorithms for review. As expected, they passed the initial automated checks. Her changes were subtle enough to appear as optimizations rather than safeguards. But she knew this was just the first step in what would be a complex and dangerous operation. During her daily project update meeting with Fincher and the other Ascension team leads, she maintained a careful facade of enthusiasm, presenting her work as exactly what had been requested: improved algorithms for accessing deeper emotional states. "Excellent work, Ms. Chen," Fincher said, reviewing her submission. "These modifications should significantly enhance our ability to capture the high-intensity experiences we need for Phase 2. "Thank you, sir," she replied, fighting to keep her voice steady. "I focused particularly on trauma response patterns, as specified." Fincher smiled, the expression not quite reaching his eyes. "Perfect. As you know, traumatic experiences create some of the most distinct neural signatures, ideal for our purposes." The casual way he discussed exploiting users' trauma made Elara's skin crawl, but she maintained her professional demeanor. "Will there be a full system test before Phase 2 implementation?" "A brief integration test tomorrow," Fincher confirmed. "But we're on an accelerated timeline. Full implementation needs to be ready for the Phase 2 testing on Friday. Just 2 days away. Even less time than Atlas had indicated." Elara exchanged a brief glance with Theo, who had been added to the test team as requested. "May I ask why the schedule has been accelerated?" Dr. Nakamura inquired, her voice carefully neutral. The original timeline included an additional week of ethical review. Fincher's expression hardened slightly. "The board has requested expedited results. Market conditions are creating pressure for a breakthrough announcement at the quarterly investor meeting next week." His tone made it clear that further questions would not be welcome. After the meeting, Elara, Theo, and Nakamura found themselves alone in the elevator. Without speaking, Nakamura pressed the button for the 37th floor, the neural labs with their Faraday shielding. Once they were safely inside lab subsection C with the isolation protocols activated, she turned to them. "They're rushing the timeline because they've detected our investigation," she said without preamble. "Security has been reviewing access logs and found our queries into the previous test data." "How bad is it?" Theo asked, anxiety evident in his voice. "Not critical yet," Nakamura replied. "I was able to justify the access as part of my ethical review process and your involvement as technical consultation. But they're suspicious. Fincher has authorized enhanced monitoring of all Ascension team members." "Which means our communication is compromised," Elara concluded. "Have you been in contact with Atlas?" Nakamura nodded. "Briefly, they're aware of the accelerated timeline and are attempting to gather external support. Regulatory contacts, journalists they trust. But it's unlikely they'll be able to mobilize any meaningful intervention before Friday." "Then it's up to us," Theo said grimly. "Our plan to redirect the consciousness data during testing is the only option left." "It's more than that now," Elara said, a realization forming as she thought through the implications. If they're rushing the timeline and increasing security, they must be planning something beyond just the Phase 2 testing. Nakamura's expression darkened. "I've had the same thought. The investor meeting next week. They're not just seeking progress to report. They're planning a demonstration." The implications were chilling. A demonstration would mean either revealing the unauthorized testing they'd already conducted or conducting new tests specifically for the investors' benefit. We need to not only stop Friday's test, but ensure they can't simply reschedule it, Elara said. That means more than just redirecting the data flow. We need to introduce a fundamental flaw in the Ascension framework itself, something that would require weeks to identify and repair. That's a significant escalation, Nakamura cautioned. Such tampering would be unmistakable sabotage. We're past the point of plausible deniability, Theo argued. If we're going to act, we should ensure it actually stops the project, not just delays it by a few days. Elara thought back to her original work on the emotional data collection system, the architecture she had created, the vulnerabilities she knew existed but had never documented. There's a way, she said slowly. The emotional mapping framework has a fundamental dependence on authentic subjective experience. If we could contaminate the reference libraries with synthetic emotional patterns, ones that appear authentic but contain subtle contradictions, the entire system would produce invalid results. The conceptual equivalent of dividing by zero, Theo said, understanding immediately. The system would appear to function normally until it attempted to actually process consciousness data, at which point it would generate irreconcilable paradoxes. Exactly. And tracing the source of the problem would require a complete audit of the reference libraries. Weeks of work at minimum. Nakamura considered this. I can provide a distraction during the integration test tomorrow. Raise enough ethical concerns to occupy Fincher and the senior staff while you implement both the data redirection and the contamination protocol. It's risky, Elara acknowledged. If we're caught, if we do nothing, dozens of people will have their consciousness violated on Friday, and potentially thousands more in the coming months, Nakamura interrupted. Some risks are necessary. As they finalized their plan, Elara couldn't shake a growing sense of unease. They were 3 people attempting to sabotage a project with billions in funding and the full resources of the world's most powerful technology company behind it. The odds of success were slim, and the consequences of failure severe. Yet the alternative, allowing Fincher to proceed with his vision of harvesting and merging human consciousness without consent, was unthinkable. Sometimes the only choice was between different kinds of danger. There's one more thing, Theo said as they prepared to leave the lab. We need a contingency plan. If something goes wrong, if we're exposed, we need a way to ensure the evidence gets out. Atlas has external contacts, Nakamura said. I'll ensure they have copies of all the documentation we've gathered. And I'll prepare a comprehensive technical explanation of what Ascension really is and how it works, Elara added. Something that can't be dismissed as conspiracy theory. Provable technical details that any qualified neural engineer would recognize as valid. As they left the lab, returning to the monitored environments of Nexus Tower, Elara felt a strange mix of dread and determination. In just over 24 hours, they would attempt to sabotage the most advanced consciousness research project in human history. Their success or failure would determine whether Arcadia remained a simulation or became something far more troubling, a hunting ground for human consciousness itself. That night, in her apartment, Elara worked tirelessly on 2 fronts, refining the code that would redirect the consciousness data during Friday's test, and developing the contamination protocol that would introduce subtle but irreparable flaws in the emotional reference libraries. It was delicate work, requiring intimate knowledge of systems she had helped design. The bitter irony wasn't lost on her. She was now working to undermine the very architecture she had once been so proud to create. A soft alert from her security system interrupted her concentration. Proximity alert. Unidentified individual monitoring building entrance. Elara froze, then quickly moved to the security feed. The building's exterior cameras showed a figure in a nondescript gray coat standing across the street, their attention clearly focused on her apartment block. As she watched, the figure raised what appeared to be a scanning device, aiming it toward the upper floors where her apartment was located. Corporate security. It had to be. Elara's heart raced as she quickly shut down her workstation and activated her apartment's privacy screens, a high-end security feature that blocked external scanning. It wouldn't hold up against a determined investigation, but it might prevent casual surveillance. She needed to warn Theo and Nakamura. But how? Their regular communications were almost certainly being monitored now. After a moment's thought, she accessed Arcadia through her personal recreational account rather than her developer credentials, logging in as a regular user would to the public sections of the virtual world. Inside Arcadia's beautiful simulation, she navigated to one of the popular social hubs, a recreated Parisian cafe where users could meet and socialize. As expected for the late hour, it was relatively quiet, with only a handful of avatars engaged in conversation. Elara had rarely used Arcadia for actual recreation, preferring to spend her limited free time in the physical world. But she knew that Theo occasionally visited certain areas, particularly the historical simulation zones. She sent him a standard social invitation through the public channels. Late-night coffee at Café Lumière. Need to discuss that book you recommended. It was innocuous enough to avoid triggering security alerts, but specific enough that Theo would recognize it as unusual coming from her. Then she settled in to wait, hoping he would understand the signal. 20 minutes later, Theo's avatar appeared at the cafe, looking confusion that shifted to concern when he spotted her. "This is unexpected," he said as he joined her at the small virtual table. "You never come to the social zones?" "I was having trouble sleeping," she replied casually, aware that their conversation might be recorded as part of Arcadia's standard data collection. "Thought I might as well enjoy the ambiance while thinking about work problems." Understanding flickered in his eyes. "Work problems keeping you up? Anything I can help with?" "Perhaps," she said, "but it's more of a security concern than a technical one. I've been noticing some unusual access patterns in my personal systems." Theo's avatar tensed slightly. "What kind of patterns?" "External scanning, possible surveillance. Probably just routine security checks, but given the sensitive nature of our current project, I thought it was worth mentioning." "I appreciate the heads up," he said carefully. "Have you noticed any other unusual activities? Communications issues, that sort of thing?" "Some delays in message delivery, yes. I think our communications infrastructure might be experiencing congestion." She sipped her virtual coffee, which provided a perfect simulation of the aroma and taste despite having no physical reality. "I might switch to alternate channels for the next few days, just to be safe." "Smart," Theo agreed, the meaningful look in his eyes confirming he understood her warning. "I've been thinking of doing the same. Sometimes the old methods are more reliable during system updates." Old methods? He was suggesting they use the secure device Atlas had provided rather than any Nexus-connected systems. Elara nodded, relieved that he had understood without her having to be more explicit. "Dr. Nakamura mentioned something similar earlier," she added, hoping to extend the warning. "She's quite security conscious." "With good reason in her position," Theo replied. "The ethics division deals with sensitive matters." They continued their conversation for another 15 minutes, discussing meaningless topics while exchanging significant glances and carefully worded references. To anyone monitoring the exchange, it would appear to be nothing more than two colleagues unwinding after hours. But they had managed to establish that all three of them were likely under surveillance and needed to switch to secure communications. As Elara prepared to log out of Arcadia, a notification appeared in her peripheral vision. A direct message from an unknown user. "Surveillance confirmed. Nexus security tracking all three of you. Proceed with caution. Atlas standing by." The message disappeared as quickly as it had appeared, leaving no trace in her message history. Atlas was still watching, still helping from the shadows. It was both reassuring and unsettling to know they had allies they couldn't identify. Back in her apartment, Elara resumed her work with renewed urgency, conscious that time was running out. The surveillance outside her building was a clear sign that Nexus suspected something, even if they didn't yet know exactly what she was planning. By morning, she had completed both the data redirection protocol and the contamination code. She transferred them to a secure memory crystal, an old-fashioned but effectively untraceable storage method, and concealed it in the hollow of her wristwatch. Tomorrow's integration test would be their only opportunity to implement the sabotage without detection. As dawn broke over New Metro, painting the polluted sky in sickly hues of orange and gray, Elara looked out at the Nexus Tower dominating the skyline. Somewhere in that building, Fincher was preparing to cross a line that would forever change the relationship between humanity and technology, harvesting consciousness itself as a resource to be exploited. She had helped build the systems that made this possible, driven by the belief that she was creating something beneficial. Now, she would have to destroy her own creation to prevent it from becoming something monstrous. The weight of that responsibility pressed down on her as she prepared for what might be the most important day of her life, and potentially the last day of her career, her freedom, or even her life if Nexus discovered what she was planning. But as she thought of the unwitting users whose very consciousness was about to be violated, she knew she had no choice. Some lines, once crossed, could never be uncrossed, and she refused to be complicit in crossing this one. With grim determination, she gathered her belongings and headed for Nexus Tower, ready to sabotage the most advanced consciousness transfer system ever created, a system she had helped build. Thank you for reading Chapter 2 of Arcadia's Code. If you're enjoying Elara's journey as she uncovers the sinister truth behind Nexus and their plans for human consciousness, please don't forget to like and subscribe for updates on the next chapter. Will Elara, Theo, and Dr. Nakamura succeed in their sabotage plan? Or is Nexus already one step ahead? Share your predictions in the comments below.